use Spring Security, but very few actually understand what happens internally when a user logs in. And in interviews, especially senior level interviews, one of the toughest question is explain the internal flow of Spring Security authentication. So in this video, I'll break down the complete authentication lifecycle step by step using this architecture diagram. So let's understand the big picture. There are six major components that are involved. First one is the user, security filters, authentication manager, authentication provider, user detail service, password encoder, security context. Now, let's decode what happens internally when a user tries to log in into our system. So when the user sends credential inside path, query param, headers, for example, user and password is being sent by the user, the request first enters the Spring security filter chain. This is critical. So Spring security is built on servlet filters that we already discussed in our previous video. For logging, the key filter is basically triggered. So there are n number of filters. Just focus on security filters. Now the HTTP servlet request is basically converted to your authentication object. So at this particular point, authentication at this particular stage, the HTTP servlet request is getting converted to your authentication object. Now, this object, what it basically contains, your user, password, and one more attribute, which is authenticated. So by default, that particular attribute is set to false, and this particular object is now being passed to the next stages of the authentication journey. So now the authentication object is sent to the authentication manager. Authentication manager is nothing but a manager which is which will delegate the authentication process to further next stages, and it basically manages all your authentication. Just basically consider it as it delegates the request to the appropriate authentication provider. Now the authentication manager will send the object to your authentication providers. There are n number of authentication providers. Then we have the user detail service or a user detail manager. So this particular service or stage will be responsible for loading your credential from your database, LDAP, or in memory. So there are a number of classes available for that. So once you retrieve your credentials from whatever the source it is, then those credentials would be sent to the next stage, which is password encoder. This password encoder stage would be basically responsible for comparing or like comparing the raw password from your login request, and it basically also encode the password from your databases and comparing, matching. So these type of stages or steps password encoder does. So there are n number of password available, bcrypt, argon 2. So we will see this later on. So if your password is basically matches or at this particular point, or if it basically not match, so any exception is thrown. So if we take in happy case, if authentication succeeds at this stage, a new authentication object is created here, and this object at this point of time, there is another object is basically created with authenticated as true. Okay, and some of the extra details, authorities and other details is also populated inside this particular object. So we will see that later. Just for the simplicity, just this object contains authenticated equals to true, that this particular user is now authenticated. Then this particular object is sent back to the authentication manager. Now Authentication Manager returns the authenticated object back to the security filter and telling that user is successfully authenticated. So the filter basically stores this object which is coming from here. So this object is getting stored inside a security context. So security context is stores your authentication object and tag it to a session ID. So whenever you are logged in, a session ID related to the browser is created, and once this particular data, Spring Security context only store the authenticated user data. Then once the data is stored, the request is now sent back to the user. The response is sent back to the user, and the response is sent back to the user, and hence this particular flow would work. So ultimately the success handlers is getting executed, and whatever the JWT or whatever the scheme you have introduced, it is being sent to the user. Now this is the complete flow. I hope like you understand it. It is difficult to understand it at the first time, but you can watch this particular part again, and it is a simple flow. So you can watch it again and understand it, because this is very much important for the point of interview, and also for the future session, because whenever you feel or whenever you are stuck with any of the bug or issues, then you need to basically remember all this flow. So let's move to our next slide. So basically here I have mentioned where we basically focus inside this flow, where we need to write most of the logic or most of the things inside the Spring Security. So we mostly write inside the security filters. So the security filters basically where JWT filters, API key filter is present. So custom authentication filter that we will be creating in next couple of sessions. So custom authentication filter that majorly we need to create, and those are working with other filters. And if we are building the stateless systems like microservices using JWT, this is the primary customization point, the Spring Security filter, and you typically extend like once per request filter, extract token, validate token, set authentication in security context. So this is where the we mostly touch or customize the code. Next is like the authentication providers. So here the core customization would be done. So this is the second major extension point. So authentication provider are responsible for the authentication logic. If you need like custom database authentication or external authentication system with IDPs, multi-factor authentication, OTP verification, SSO. So you implement your own authentication provider, and this is where the core credential validation logic is belongs. And but notice something important, like you are not modifying the authentication managers, you are plugging the new uh, providers into your authentication manager. The next is the your user detail service or user detail manager. So this is the most common extension point for backend developers. If you have custom user schema, custom role tables, multi-tenant database, external IDP, so you implement user detail service, and Spring Security calls your implementation automatically, and you don't manually wire it into your every request. So you just provide the bean and the framework handles the orchestration. The next is like password encoder. So password encoder is not optional, and you never store a password as a plain text in your database or anywhere else. So Spring Security supports different types of password encoding algorithms. Some of like bcrypt, argon2, pbkdf2. So your job is simply here to define the encoder bean, and authentication provider will use it internally and automatically. So what you rarely touch is regarding the authentication manager and security context. Here is the important architecture. Inside you rarely like modify the authentication manager, you rarely modify security context, you rarely modify. So these are like infrastructure components. Spring Security handles them internally, and you should focus on the edge and the extension points and the plugin components that we already discussed. So we will deep dive in the coding part in the next sessions for validating the same flow inside the code. So this comes to our end of the video. Subscribe to this channel and share this with your developer friends, and I'll see you in the next lecture where we will break down the complete Spring Security flow. And thank you for watching.